Okay, guys, welcome to part two. We were talking about Texas independence previous to this. So after Texas declared independence and won its independence from Mexico, it immediately asked the United States for statehood, since the majority of Texans were actually Americans. However, the request caused significant debate in Congress and in the country. First of all, Texas would upset the balance of slave and free states that had been so carefully determined by the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And this is a question about, as America was expanding, where were the slave and where the free states going to be? Second, the question arose of, would annexing Texas cause a war with Mexico? The United States hadn't been in a war since 1812, and there was serious concern that, a war with Mexico might turn into another world war and, hurt the United States. Especially since the United States was in the panic of 1837 right now. The economy wasn't very good. War really kind of was one of the last things that Americans wanted to get into. So the debate in Congress ultimately led to the United States rejecting Texas's request to become a state. The debate went on in Congress for about 7 or 8 years. Texas initially asked in 1837, and then the Texas issue became a big issue in 1844. And the topic of 1844 was expansion and was manifest destiny. As more and more Americans started to move to Oregon, and there were rumors about potentially gold in California, and then the opportunity to expand into Texas and expand cotton production, expansion was the topic. So there were two major candidates in the election of 1844. There was a Democrat, James K. Polk, and a Whig, Henry Clay. Now, by the way, this is Henry Clay's 5th time running for president. The poor guy that just kept running him out there, and he just kept losing. And one of the reasons was he lost in this particular election is because he wouldn't support the annexation of Texas. Henry Clay didn't want to come out and specifically take a position on slavery. Even though he was a Westerner and he did tend to sometimes agree with the Western-Southern point of view, he didn't want to come out and support that because he got most of his support from Whigs who were in the North, in New England. James K. Polk, on the other hand, was able to win the election of 1844 because he embraced manifest destiny. One of his campaign slogans was 54, 40, or fight, referring to Oregon. The 54, 40 degree of latitude was all of Oregon, the entire section. And he was said in his campaign that he would go to war with Great Britain in order to get all of Oregon and annex it to the United States. He supported the annexation of Texas, even though it would expand slavery, and he promised that if he were president, he would go after California and Oregon, and as I said, get all of them added to the United States. James K. Polk won that election in 1844 and 1845. He becomes our 11th president. And so he starts on the path to fulfill many of his campaign promises. So in 1845, with the victory of Polk, Democrats also had the majority. They approved the annexation of Texas for statehood. In 1846, Polk was able to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain where Oregon would be divided in half at the 49th parallel. You see right here. And this set our border, and our present-day border, with Canada. If you want to learn about all kinds of really interesting inconsistencies with this border, take AP Human Geography because we talk about it. But anyway, Oregon became a free state, Texas a slave state, and that maintains that balance in Congress, which is one of the other reasons why Texas was able to be annexed. So take a moment, stop and check, pause the video, and think about why some Americans were concerned about annexing Texas. And when you're ready, you can move on with PowerPoint. So the annexation of Texas brought along with it some of the problems that Texas had as a republic. First of all, Texas had a lot of debt. But second of all, they had that border dispute that we talked about with Mexico before. So as we said before, Mexico claimed that Texas's border was on the Nueces River, and Texas claimed its border was on the Rio Grande River, which again is our current border with Mexico. So President Polk decided to test Mexico's resolve and how strongly they wanted to defend this particular border. So he sent troops to the disputed border area. Mexico also sent troops to the disputed border area, and when they crossed the Rio Grande River, Polk claimed that the Mexican troops invaded the United States of America. And so he asked Congress for a declaration of war because Mexico invaded the United States. That declaration of war was granted, and the United States declared war on Mexico in 1847. The Mexican War was fairly quick. Mexico's fighting force really didn't stand a chance for the United States. We invaded Mexico, captured San Diego, captured Mexico City, and by 1848 the war was over. There were some uprisings with Americans in Northern California in 1847, where California actually was an independent republic for a few months. But ultimately, the United States wins, and in 1848, we signed a treaty with Mexico in which they ceded to us or gave us the territory that's now California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, and Texas, and we paid them $15 million in compensation for that. So the Mexican War is significant later on because many of the generals in the Civil War got their experience as officers in the Mexican War. So they really learned, how to apply a war plan in the Mexican War. And the Mexican War would also have caused significant controversy in the United States when it came to the question of slavery and abolitionism, and kind of American values. So approximately 150,000 Mexicans came under control of America with the Mexican Cession, and a lot of them faced discrimination due to their cultural differences. They spoke Spanish and they were Catholic. And so in a lot of places, Mexican culture was suppressed. There were laws that passed that prevented Catholics or from meeting or people from speaking Spanish. And so a lot of these Mexicans kind of really felt out of place, even though they had been living in places like New Mexico and Arizona, for generations. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to guarantee these rights, but of course they didn't. And in a lot of times, in a lot of situations, states purposely discriminated against these people. California is, again, a unique situation. We're talking about this in class. It's going to be one of our focuses. But in 1848, gold was discovered in Sutter's Mill, California, which is not far from San Francisco. It's in the foothills of Sierra Nevada mountain. And when President Polk kind of convinced America that this was real, it wasn't one of those false gold stories, that yes, people actually were finding gold here, thousands and thousands of people started to come from California from all around the world, from Europe, Eastern America, even China, and Hawaii. San Francisco was a city of about 15,000 people in 1848. By 1852, there were nearly 200,000 people living in Northern California around that area. What were some of the consequences of such that large population boom? Well, there's a lot of them. I mean, first of all, you got to find a place to put all those people. You got rapid building, you got unsafe structures, you have ridiculous inflation when it comes to the price of goods and materials. And you have, in the case of California, you have mostly men living there, not a lot of women. So sometimes you had some discrimination and gender discrimination, also serious discrimination against Native Americans that lived in that territory. And that's one of the things we're going to get to in class as we kind of investigate one American's experience in the California Gold Rush. One other migration west that happened during this time was the Mormon migration to Utah. We're going to talk about the Mormons again in a little bit different context when we get to the Second Great Awakening and some of the cultural movements in America. But the Mormons were a religious group originally founded in Western New York by Joseph Smith. They weren't welcome there because they had some sort of different religious beliefs, which we'll get into. Non-mainstream for the time period. So they migrated first to Nauvoo, Illinois, and then again persecuted there. Joseph Smith was actually killed in a riot there, and so Brigham Young, who kind of took over the Mormon congregation, asked Congress for permission to start a colony in Salt Lake City, Utah, and so they left in 1846 and settled in originally what they called Provo. and eventually turned into Salt Lake City. But the Mormon Trail actually became one of the overland trails west. So as people started to go to Oregon or California, they would follow kind of the same path that the Mormon settlers did to Salt Lake City, and then they would meet up with fur trappers and things like that, people like that would get them through the Rocky Mountains here, and then over the Sierra Nevadas into California. So their role in westward expansion was important as they kind of established this sort of accepted path on one of the trails, the Mormon Trail. The other one, the Oregon Trail, which kind of split off here near Fort Laramie and kind of went north a little bit up in this direction. So overall, the results of Manifest Destiny, the United States ends up expanding to the Pacific and begins to dominate North America, just like John O'Sullivan said they were destined to do. There was mass migration to Oregon, Texas, and especially California. America fought its first really large-scale foreign war. You know, there was the Barbary War, the war in Tripoli that, you know, we sent a few warships over, but this is his really first large-scale foreign war in which we invaded a country and won. And then there's these issues that start arising in America regarding civil rights and slavery. How are we going to treat people that are of different cultures, and the expansion of slavery? Big topic that, of course, we're going to get into because, as we know, it's one of the core causes of the Civil War. So we'll talk about this some more in class and develop it, but it's kind of an overview of the time period. Thanks for listening. Just take a look at these this stop and check question here. Which of the following was not one of James K. Polk's goals for his presidency? And mark down your right answer. And one more note about James K. Polk. He's probably the best president that you've never heard of. I know many people will talk about some of the best presidents ever, and typically Lincoln and Washington and FDR come up. But I really have to give some props to James K. Polk. He's a kind of controversial person, a lot like Andrew Jackson, because he was sort of a Southern supporter. But one thing that I do like about James K. Polk was that he made campaign promises and he followed through on them. He made it very clear what he was going to do. He went out and did it, and once he accomplished those goals, then he didn't run for office again. He said, well, there's really nothing left for me to do here, so let's let someone else have a go at it. So I kind of respect him for that, but he's also that president that's responsible for the final third of the United States. You know, we attribute Washington with the first third, Jefferson with the second third, and then we should attribute Polk to the final third in Texas, California, and Oregon. So thanks for listening. We'll talk more about this more in class, and have a good one.